Welcome, Professor Eaton, and thank you for being with us here today in the Technological University of the Shannon as we celebrate our Research Week and also our MEHL series of engaging with leading experts in their fields on various topics related to pedagogy. You're recognised in terms of your international work on academic integrity and supporting the work across the world of higher education institutions. As you know, in Ireland we have been working on academic integrity through the National Academic Integrity Network, and more recently NAIN and Intutor project working together to address the topic. So I'd like, if it was okay, to focus today on your recent work published in the International Journal for Education Integrity and future-proofing integrity in the age of artificial intelligence and neurotechnology, prioritising human rights, dignity and equity. So a really interesting lens to look at the topic. So Sarah, in terms of reconciling our approaches to maintaining high ethical standards and the fundamental rights of every person, can you give us an outline of how you think this should influence the development of policy in higher education?
Well, that's a massive question. So first of all, that's all right. Thanks for the invitation to come here and join you and talk about this. This is really like one of my favorite topics. So maybe I can frame it a little bit by just a little bit of background and say, working at the International Journal for Educational Integrity, once a year I write an editorial. And this year it was inspired by some work I'd done with UNESCO, right, as part of their Women for Ethical AI platform. And through that work, we looked at the Council of Europe's work on human rights by design for artificial intelligence policy and dug into that work and then related it to gender and equity for artificial intelligence, and then took that work and sort of played with it a little bit and thought, how might we extend these concepts of human rights and human rights by design for academic integrity policy, right? So I work at a university where there's no AI policy, and lots of universities that I'm talking with, and they're in the same boat. I'm like, okay, AI policies aside, what if we looked at this for academic integrity policy, and what might that mean? Because we've been talking about equity and inclusion and accessibility in academic integrity for a number of years now, right? And I'm inspired by the work of people like Tracy Bretagne and Mary Davis and others. But this idea of human rights was new in this discourse, even for me. And I thought, well, what would it mean to look at our policies, whether it's a policy development or a policy renewal, taking this human rights by design approach and designing or redesigning policies through the lens of human rights. That was a fantastic new idea for me. And I thought, what if we played with this? What might that look like? Yeah. So that's what the whole editorial was about for last year.
And that word then of equity of treatment. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting one in the context of the equity of treatment of dealing with cases of academic misconduct and calling that out in the right language perhaps, and then the equity for staff and students in that dialogue, perhaps getting some ideas around that for yourself. I've heard you talking about that principle of equity and in a way the language that we use in dealing with these cases.
Mm-hmm. So. And now, I start here with like my bias as a Canadian, right, and bring my Canadian language into this, and we talk about equity deserving groups. And I think in the United States they talk about equity seeking groups. And so we're like, well, a person can be deserving of equitable treatment. They shouldn't have to go out and seek it. So if you're a person with a disability, for example, you deserve to have equitable and just treatment. So we start there. So we talk about equity deserving groups, right? And so those might be otherwise framed as marginalized groups or persons with disabilities or racialized minorities. There's different kinds of equity deserving groups, and there may be intersectionality in there as well. And so this is kind of the framing, I guess, and my Canadian bias that I bring into the work. And then thinking about this in terms of policy, that's not to say that we throw away equality, because equality is sort of a baseline for our policies, right? And so we can have baseline equality in terms of standards that we expect for our students in terms of conduct. But then we also might want to consider things like what additional supports might students from equity deserving groups need? to support them acting with integrity.
Okay.
Right? So that might be academic accommodations as one kind of equitable way.
So what I'm hearing, so can equality and equity be reconciled?
I think, we can think of equity as sort of leveling up equality. We don't throw away equality, right? That's like the foundation. And then we say, okay, we've got the foundation, and how do we improve on that? Because equality, I have a colleague, Keita Gladue, University of Calgary, and she says, if the system is invisible to you, it's because it was made for you.
Yes. Yeah.
And if the system suddenly becomes visible and problematic, it's because it was made for some kind of equal standard that we might not fit into. And so we can think of equity as leveling up equality.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I've always been interested in the concept of restorative justice, in the wider, because a previous life. But what place should restorative justice approaches have in the context of managing academic misconduct?
Oh, it's a big question. But I think probably we can simplify it into our approaches to misconduct might be historically punitive, sort of rooted in a crime and punishment. The consequence must fit the offense, so to speak. Then we can think of educative, or we'll layer on some rehabilitative workshops, training, and this is sort of an evolution that maybe didn't exist 20, 30 years ago. And then there's sort of the next version, I think the next evolution, which might be a restorative practice. But it's expensive. It requires training. There's one university in Canada, and regrettably it's not my own. There's one university in Canada, MacEwan University, that uses restorative approaches as their first response to academic misconduct, recognizing it doesn't work in all cases, so that the person who's found responsible must be willing to take responsibility.
Yes.
And starting from this idea of rather than crime and punishment, thinking about what are the harms and who's been harmed, and how do we repair the harm. And what does that even mean, right? And if we sort of take it to an extreme, in extreme cases of academic misconduct, you've got the progressive discipline models, first offense, low sanction, and so on and so forth, with the ultimate version being exclusion or expulsion. Yes. And that's sort of the end outcome. And then in a restorative approach, we flip it on its head. And instead of saying, well, instead of you being excluded, what does it take to keep you included in our community in a way that we can continue to trust you and you can continue to trust us? These are big questions, right?
Yeah.
And it flips the whole model on its head, but it really starts with, we want you in our community and we have standards and you're expected to abide by those standards. So let's work together to fix what has been damaged together, reconcile it, repair it, and then carry on.
And just in terms of one of the conversations we've had this morning, when you presented here in TUS, and you presented that model of the distribution of people, shall we say, and the disposition to engage in, misconduct. Can we have what you were discussing there, that restorative model, applied to people at the end of the continuum who deliberately and perhaps always will be disposed to academic misconduct and the contract chief? How does that work?
Maybe not, right? And if we think of like that bell curve of normal, and we've got those outliers that never cheat, and then the outliers that sort of repeatedly cheat, restorative practices may not work for that group, right? And I think one of those principles around the restorative resolutions is that starting from the position of the person must be willing to take responsibility for their actions and be interested in repairing the harm.
Right.
And then if they're not, then we would keep those traditional administrative processes. It's not to say that we get rid of the punitive approach or the educative approach, but the educative approach might not work with the serial cheater, if you will, right? So we kind of need both. And I think there's a place for restorative resolutions, but knowing also it requires training for staff and sort of a critical mass of staff who can have those restorative conferences.
And funny enough, that's kind of reflecting the work that we embedded in the case management framework approach, to having the right level of conversation depending on the nature of the intent, shall we say, vis-a-vis the students. I might shift to just the nature of policies and procedures in the context for a lot of registrars and vice presidents for academic affairs and registrars. What role do you think students need to have or should have in the context of developing policies in this area?
So the role of students, having students at the table during policy development and revision, and asking students, how might this policy affect you? What are your thoughts on it, right? And including them in the process and then also in things like, depending how, if you have case hearings or appeals hearings, having student representation there as well.
And it's interesting again because of the work that we've been doing, here in Ireland and looking at the case management framework and even wider through the tutor. We did focus groups with students. And going back to the previous theme about equity, they felt very strongly about the institutions having equitable policies and procedures to deal with academic misconduct. They felt very strongly about this, which is interesting, and they wanted to be seen to happen, because for their award, that sense that I've earned my academic award, which is important to them. Sometimes we write, and maybe more than sometimes, policies from our disposition and the language that we use. How do you think that we should probably reframe or position the language in relation to this particular area to either assure greater buy-in by staff and students in relation to the policy?
I think some of our policies that have developed over the past couple of decades came out of thinking around misconduct as deviant behavior and had been treated as deviant behavior. And we ended up with these policies that really sort of criminalized deviant behavior. So one of the things we've done at our university is we've made a point to decriminalize the policy language. So we don't find students guilty of plagiarism. We hold them responsible for their behavior. Right. So, and this idea of we don't have punishments or sanctions anymore, and we now have consequences. Right. So I can give you this example of so we have these restorative or resolution workshops for students. So say you've had a plagiarism finding, and you can be mandated to take a reciting and referencing workshop. Well, that used to be sort of under a category of sanctions or punishments. So I challenged a previous administrator and said, we've got these workshops, which are a kind of learning, under this list of punishments, but we're an institution of learning, and so under no circumstances should learning be a punishment. And she agreed with me. And so I was like, it was just something that nobody had thought to challenge before. So when we can call it outcomes, we can call it consequences. And still the idea of there's a misconduct and there's a consequence. But we don't need to turn it into kind of an academic catastrophe.
And that's the importance for how we frame it, isn't it, for the students as well. We might come to the topic about how best to navigate the boundaries between artificial intelligence and academic integrity. And obviously in the context of your recent paper, you might just give us some ideas in that area and perspectives.
I mean, I kind of feel like it's still unfolding in a way. Here we are, in 2025, we've had 2 years since ChatGPT came out, and the world continues to evolve. I think it's fair to say AI is not going anywhere, but I really get concerned with the conflation of the use of artificial intelligence apps with misconduct, right? And so that, using AI is not automatically a kind of misconduct. It can be, depending on what the expectations of the program, the module are, and what the instructor expects. We still need some internalized knowledge in some fields. But the idea of thinking, how might we use AI in ways that are ethical? And I think that's what the whole world's trying to unpack, responsible and ethical use of AI. So I think it's to kind of have a little bit of caution around this use of this assumption that if students are using these tools, they're automatically trying to deceive or take shortcuts. They may be in some cases, and ultimately thinking about using AI to supplement learning rather than circumvent it. can be something that we can think about.
And again, I suppose that's in our control to do when in the classroom are supporting the students with their assessment, making that very clear and explicit in terms of the usage of Gen AI. What's its purpose, you know, as you say. Yeah.
And I'm not sure where you're at in Ireland, but I can say, you know, by and large, from what I know about what's happening in Canada, faculty are not being trained properly. You know, the curious ones are taking it upon themselves to try it out. But now, for example, on our campus, we're a Microsoft campus, our IT department just quietly turned on Microsoft Copilot in September for all 45,000 students. And 2,000 academic staff and 2,000 additional staff. So everybody can access it. I suspect, I mean, no one has a crystal ball, but I suspect in a few years it will get to the point of it's embedded in our everyday tools. And by then we won't have to go to a different app. We won't have to go to ChatGPT because it will simply be there when you open Word or whatever program.
And it nearly is.
It nearly is, yeah.
Because we're on Microsoft. And interesting, I know ourselves and TUS and the Centre for Pedagogical Innovation and Development, we've looked at that role to try and support our academic community in terms of training and becoming familiar with what we mean about Gen AI and, you know, supporting the staff. So I might just wrap up there, Sarah, in terms of, obviously you're aware of the work we're doing in Ireland, and if you could give us any insights or contributions in terms of the value of that moving forward, what would be your sense of that from, you know, looking in of what we need to do?
Well, I mean, I've said it before on different occasions, and I'll say it again. From what I've seen, Ireland has truly become a global leader for academic integrity with all of the resources that you have from NAIN, the National Lexicon, and the other resources that you have. I don't know of any other country that has a national lexicon for academic integrity. I'm terribly envious, and I wish we had something like that in Canada, and we don't. I mean, from the outside looking in, I just can't wait for more. So to keep up the work and thinking about, you know, education in 2035 and what might we look like 10 years ahead, and all of the resources that you have now, we need more of it. Because I think the world is now looking to Ireland, to be quite honest, as an exemplar of excellence, and we're all anxiously awaiting for what's the next bit coming out of NAIN. So I'm excited to see what comes next.
That's great, Sarah, and I think that from being in NAIN, that comes from us all working together, because that has been the underpinning foundation of the work and what we've achieved so far. So thank you sincerely for your time today. Very much appreciated.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.